Welcome to the Standard Deviations podcast, presented by Orion Advisor Solutions and hosted by Dr. Daniel Crosby, Orion's Chief Behavioral Officer and New York Times best-selling author. Looking for ways to help your clients become less susceptible to market fluctuations and peer influence? Get powerful personalization for every investor with Orion Custom Indexing, our tech-enabled solution for managing tax-efficient, customized portfolios at scale. Learn more at orion.com/custom indexing.
Hello and welcome to the Standard Deviations podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Daniel Crosby, and today I am joined by my friend Amanda Clayman, who is a financial therapist who helps people bring money into balance. She's the host of the upcoming Fresh Produce Media podcast, The Root of the Problem for Audible. And to learn about the inglorious start of her financial wellness mission, we're going to actually start by talking about a $19,000 haircut. Wow. Welcome.
Hi, Daniel. Thank you so much for having me.
You've been on a travel misadventure. We won't get into all of it, but you have been in travel hell, and yet you're still here, bright-eyed, ready to share some wisdom with my listeners. So thank you for being here.
Yes, I'm bringing a fun, chaotic energy to our talk this morning, so I expect it'll be loose and interesting, and I'm excited to get into it.
If I could mandate it, I wish that all of my guests would be sort of sleep deprived and like mildly chaotic. It would be great for rating. It would be great for rating. So we're glad you're here in your current state.
Yeah.
Listen, when people ask me why I became a psychologist, it's very easy. It's to figure out my own mess, right? To figure out the mess between my ears. But you found yourself into your role by way of a $19,000 haircut. No pressure. I think this might be the greatest story in the history of standard deviation stories. Tell us about the $19,000 haircut.
Well, first, by way of introduction, I would like to say I'm a person who in general needs to learn lessons the hard way. There's a great quote, I think it's John Kenneth Galbraith, and he says that when people are faced with the prospect of having to do something different or find evidence to the fact that they don't have to do something different, most of us get right to work on finding that evidence so we don't have to change. So what was happening in my life, this is, I first kind of encountered what it meant to think about and use money as a young adult, like most of us do. And I had moved to New York, determined to have an adventure. I moved with no savings. I, in fact, secured my first apartment by paying the first month's deposit and broker's fee by actually using those convenience checks that come from your credit card company, writing them out to myself, depositing them into my bank account, and then giving certified checks.
A little light financial fraud to start.
Yeah. Didn't know. 22. I mean, just trying to figure it out. I was determined to figure it out, which is, I think, what most of us at 22 are trying to do. We're taking sort of what our parents have taught us. And as I learned, I was taking what they explicitly taught me, but also there was a lot of implicit learning that I had done as a child with money. And so I kind of was there to move to New York and just figure it all out. And I did, but one of the ways that I was figuring that out is I was starting to accumulate debt. Yes, I had a nice big jump start on that with securing that apartment, but I was earning very little. I was living in a high cost of living city. Money was the least important thing, I would say, in my life at that moment. And so I kept thinking as I earn more money, I'm just going to figure this out. I'm going to be able to pay down these debts, but that never happened. So I'm feeling the tension level rise on my financial life. And it was really getting to a breaking point where I felt so ashamed, like I couldn't reconcile. There was a lot of dissonance between all of the good things that I was doing. I was learning how to figure it out and take care of myself in a big city. I was independent. I was excelling at my job. I was advancing. All of these things were happening. And yet I felt like such a fraud. And I was living in such shame because I was so anxious about money. I wasn't paying my bills on time. My debt was going up and up. And what happened was my mother came to visit me, and I asked her to cut my hair. And she used to cut my hair as a child. I had some very precious bowl cut pictures of my childhood that I could share. But she did a decent job. And so it wasn't that weird to say, like, Mom, can you give me a little trim? Unfortunately, my tastes had really changed. I was now a New Yorker, and the old bowl cut special was kind of not doing the job anymore. And so when I saw the haircut that she gave me, I burst into tears. And she said, "Oh, don't panic. We can call your hairdresser, tell her it's an emergency." And that was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back, because I had to say, "Oh no, last time I went to my hairdresser, I paid with a check, and the check bounced, and I can't go back until I can figure that out. And by the way, I have all of this debt." And basically, it's just like the truth started to tumble out of me. And this was so shocking to my mother, who had no idea that it was going on. And this was the moment of truth, the moment of hitting bottom, the moment when I sort of threw up my hand and said, "I don't know what to do. I need help." That started off me turning and facing my financial problems and the emotional and behavioral patterns in my life that really contributed toward that debt. I knew better. I could have managed, I think, to not have put myself into that kind of situation and accumulated that debt. But it was a $19,000 haircut because, and this is way back in the 90s, so I think the inflation or adjusted amount is more in the 30s. Yeah. And so like that haircut was the catalyst. I mean, it's funny. I would take any amount of financial stress, but bad hair, no, not for 1 minute, not for one day. But that was the thing where I started telling the truth. I started trying to, my mom helped me come up with a budget. I was able to say, like, these are all of the ways that I am not managing this. And to have an honest conversation and to begin really exploring how I had the lessons that my parents had tried to teach me, because they both grew up in poverty. Those lessons, what I had really absorbed with that was a tremendous amount of anxiety around money, that I did not have the tools to manage that anxiety. And so it was the kind of expression of that was that I was so avoidant in my financial life that I was creating a lot of chaos for myself. So that was the beginning of a journey of not just paying back that $19,000 in debt that I had and on my credit cards, but also starting to be super curious about, like, I'm a smart person. How did I get myself into this kind of trouble? And as I started talking about it too with friends and saying, like, some of the things that we do to spend time together, I really can't afford to do those. And then hearing back from my friends, like, "Oh, thank God you said something. Yeah. I can't afford it either." And that made me just look around and go, are we all suffering in silence here and playing a part that we think we're supposed to? Like, are we using money in the ways that we think we're supposed to, or the ways that we want to present ourselves a certain way? Like, these are all really powerful motivators in people's lives, and money kind of gets dragged along for the ride in those experiences. And I started thinking, isn't this interesting? What if there was a way to look at all of the thoughts and the behaviors and the feelings that we're experiencing that directly relate to how we think about and use money, and to be able to look at those and hold those different perspectives at the same time, and to be able to see how the relationship between them and how those parts of our lives really talk to each other, and to be able to come into, with that process, being able to kind of like go into our wise mind and say that it's not just about focusing on the money. It's not just about focusing on the feelings. What we really need to do is to be able to hold those pieces holistically together. And I wanted to be the place where people could do that. So it was a whole career change, a whole life overhaul, really even changed my relationship with my parents, to have that kind of honesty and have that opportunity to be reparented in that particular way.
What was your parents' reaction to that? I'm curious how it changed your relationship to your parents. I have a less dramatic story, but my dad, who's perhaps the most calm person I know, I remember being at dinner with friends and I was on his cell phone plan. And this is back in the days of paying for text and roaming and whatever. He calls me at dinner. I decline it. He calls me again. I'm like, okay, well, maybe something's up. I'm going to pick this up. I pick it up and he is like very stern, like in control, but very sternly, like, your cell phone bill this month was $300. He's like, I could have a Mercedes for what I'm paying for your cell phone bill. Cut it out immediately.
Mm-hmm.
And that was like the long and short of it. But it was this moment where you know things, but when you know them emotionally, it catalyzes a whole different set of behaviors. I knew I was screwing up. Like I knew I was taking advantage of their kindness and I knew I was doing too much. But it was only when that emotion got tripped, kind of like with your haircut, like you knew you weren't doing great, but it takes an emotional catalyst to kind of snap you into that awareness that you need to do better. So all of this to say, how did this change things with your parents, and how did this moment sort of change things, especially given how they grew up?
I would say that it was a learning experience for all of us. Because first of all, my mother was just shocked. She really had no idea. I was very good at just kind of walling off this part of my life and not talking about it. I think also she experienced the same kind of like, well, I thought you were doing so well. All of these other things are going well in your life. How can money be so different from that? Like, how can you be so confident and competent and achievement oriented in these particular ways, and money can still be a mess? And now I have tons of data. Yeah, that's not a question anymore. So I think it after the shock wore off and there was a kind of plan in place, it changed our family culture around money to something that we talked about very differently. It mobilized my parents to also be able to give me the kind of support that I needed in terms of like I would never have called them before and said like, I just paid off this card, and then get the congratulations and the support and, atta girl. I couldn't get that support because I wasn't sharing that information. Oh, and, I wasn't paying off any cards at that point either. But I mean, like by telling the truth, I think it opened all of us up to tell the truth a lot more, including my parents reviewing kind of the financial trauma that they had been through and starting to reflect on that and see how that had really shaped them to the point where fast forward 20 years and like my mother, we lost my stepdad in 2020, and my mom has had all of these big financial events in her life as a widow, and has had to, and I think that the language like a financial therapy has been so helpful for her in having in her journey of growing into all of these other capacities in terms of like now she's really feeling in charge of her financial destiny as an individual for the first time. And she can see that as a growth experience.
Yeah. As
just opposed to I've lost my husband and now this is a loss and now I have to do this. So it's really, I think it's helped all of us. And I think that's the message of financial therapy and changing our financial culture more broadly. It helps all of us when we learn to be more perceptive about the holistic nature of money and to be able to be more honest about that too.
Yeah, I love your $19,000 haircut story because besides being a great story, there's so much richness and so many nuggets of truth in there. The ability of emotion to catalyze like a change of behavior. The the sigh of relief it is when we all just start being honest about money. I mean, I kind of giggled at the part about your friends where it's just like, oh gosh, can we all stop pretending like we have money for these $25 drinks? We don't, like, can we do something else? Can we play cards and talk at somebody's house? Such a freeing thing. So I want to talk about some of your work now. You wrote a piece titled "Are Your Finances a Mess?" That's curious, that I loved, and within it, you have sort of two primary points that I think are really worth discussing. And you say that all financial problems can be approached with two premises in mind. The first is that all financial behavior has meaning. And the second is that all financial behavior serves a purpose. All financial behavior has meaning and all financial behavior serves a purpose. I think that flies in the face of how we in the industry sometimes talk about it. I'd love to hear what you have to say there.
Yes, the idea that financial behavior is rationally motivated, I think is a big overreach. I think that we can have rational processes with money, for sure. That's one of the things that we talk about, right, in this work, is how to think clearly about money. But all behavior, and not just financial behavior, but all behavior is really meant to serve a need, right? We experience something, it feels like something is missing, that prompts us to take an action. Otherwise, as human beings, we're happy to kind of like sit and just be satisfied, right? But that's not our human condition. So the motivation, the kind of energy comes from this sense of ourselves as needing something. But the thing about needs is that they're rarely just one need at a time. With clients, I talk about the matrix of competing needs. So for example, like when it comes to money, you might have a need to curb your spending, or you might have a big goal of trying to save for something in the future. But at the moment, you're feeling pretty hungry and you're feeling kind of insecure. And if there's anything that we have really been conditioned and taught to do in our culture, which is a very capitalistic, which has its foundation is capitalism, what we're conditioned to do is when we experience a need or a sense of dis-ease, we can identify a product or service associated with it. There's something that it's a well-worn kind of path in our brain. I feel a need. There's something outside of me that I need to bring in or acquire in order to meet that need. So that's part of the challenge then of recognizing when we're evaluating our financial behavior and some of the choices that we make, instead of just thinking, I'm bad, I'm a failure, I don't have any discipline. If we're curious about it, we might say, what's the need underneath that? When I was doing a lot of my spending, the needs that I was experiencing were like to acknowledge the anxiety that I was feeling around money would be so overwhelming to me that it would impair my functioning in these other areas of my life. So the ego defense, right, of compartmentalization was working really well for me, not for my money, but it did allow me to kind of act in a functional way in all of these other areas of our lives. So the curiosity comes from what's the reason that this is happening for me? If I want to be my own kind of like advocate here, what's going on underneath this behavior? And to be curious about like, what was happening to me before? Or what are the thoughts that come up for me around this? What is the judge and jury in my head when I'm sort of standing in line with something to buy? And there's that voice that's saying like, you can have it. It's good. It's on sale. And then that other voice that's going, you're stupid. This is bad. Why are you doing this again? That's a really painful moment to be in when we think one of those voices has to be the truth. But when we say, I'm really curious what these voices have to tell me, and maybe where I'm really curious in a compassionate way, to try to greet the need or the feeling that is underneath that activity. And so I feel like money has this really wonderful kind of ancillary benefits, not built into the plan of money, but in this moment of time, one of the benefits of money is that money surfaces, because money is everywhere in our lives, money surfaces all of these parts of ourselves and emotions and thoughts. And if we can be in that curious place with money and allow money to kind of be a messenger sometimes for us about what's going on inside of us, we have this great opportunity, I think, to remake our relationship with money instead of trying to force it just into a certain kind of like behavioral pattern. And what I find is that money often sort of points us toward these opportunities to also heal and grow and reclaim parts of ourselves that we've kind of walled off because we think that they're dangerous for our financial health.
Yeah, I love that. There's so much judgment associated with money, both us within ourselves and then from the outside coming in. Read something recently that said the number one fear people had when presenting to the office of a financial planner was that they would be judged harshly. Basically, you bring the documentation, you present it to her, and then it's like, oh, you've been screwing up. Kind of like, oh, you're doing it all wrong. And I love this attitude of curiosity and everything that it can unearth within us. And, I think a lot of times curiosity is curative, right? Like once we understand, Jung has this quote that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. A lot of us are kind of on autopilot with our money. And if we can take these two premises that you've set forth and really be curious about why we're doing something, an awareness of why and a deeper understanding of how we're acting a lot of times is enough, I think, to right the ship. You go, oh, okay, well, I was trying to get this need met. I can get it, met another way that doesn't hamper my, my financial well-being, and then you're on your way. So, in another piece, you talked a bit about your own family money story. In another piece, you talked about family money scripts, and you named 4 in specific, right? Events, messages, feelings, and meanings. What are family money scripts? Start at a high level. Talk to us about what a family money script is. And then if you don't mind, get into a little more granularity with these sort of 4 pillars of a family money script.
Yeah. One of the things that, when you were saying in the beginning that you were trying to figure out the space between your own ears, I really resonate with that because I love the saying that every psychiatrist is their own first patient. That we go into this phase because we're saying like, I don't even understand myself. How can I understand myself and therefore understand more about the human condition? My story really began with understanding what I had inherited, like what my original programming was, and to think about how people learn, how human beings learn. And the way that we learn, first and foremost, is in a relational context in our family. Because money has no objective, concrete meaning. The way that money is incredibly relational in that it touches all of these different parts of our lives. So when we think about little kids and the way that children learn, children are highly attuned, first and foremost, to the emotions of their caregivers. And that's one of those things that keeps us safe as human beings. Like we are so connected with our grownups. So first of all, what is something that pushes grownups' buttons? Ding, 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 it's money, right? So on one level, children are going to be aware of the kind of emotional context of money. It's probably one of the first things that they're going to pick up on. So they may, in terms of like the experiences that they have, one experience may be, gosh, I noticed that my parents are talking about money, or I hear my mom or dad responding to me when I ask for something. and saying like, how can you even ask for that? Don't you know that that's so expensive? So we're getting like identity messages. We're being told that we're selfish. We're seeing that a parent gets mad or upset or anxious around money. So we're kind of absorbing that in these different experiences and the emotional context of that. So children are kind of picking up that feeling. And I was a really sensitive kid, and I definitely was absorbing my parents' anxiety about money. So we've got our experiences, we've got the emotional context, we get the messages, which is like, what's directly said about money? Are people talking about you want to put your money to work for you? Or are people talking about like, you never know when something's going to happen, and so you have to really enjoy your life? Children are sponges for those kinds of platitudes, which, are so basic they can't possibly cover all instances, but it gives us an idea of what we think or how we think money should work in this world and how we can fit ourselves into that. And the last piece of it is the meaning that the child themselves puts together. So as kids are kind of like taking all of this stuff in, they're starting to prepare a sense of, what does this mean for me? Like, what does this mean in my life? How am I going to be a financial grown-up given the examples and experiences that I've had? And that's the really tricky one, because children don't have mature understanding. So when we get launched into the world as young adults, a lot of times that meaning that we have kind of put together for ourselves, I tend to think of it as like our 1.0 money programming software. Like, this is what we're loaded with going into adulthood, but then we kind of become adults, and then we run that program, right? We're running it. This is what I've been taught, and the way that I see money working in this world. And some of us run into problems when we run that software. Sometimes that works great, and we don't even see the psychology of money doesn't even make sense, because everything just seems so, when it works the way that we anticipate it's going to work, we don't think about it very much. There's no need to, because it's fine. But for the rest of us, we're out in this world going, this isn't going the way that I was taught that it's supposed to go. Now what? Now how do I figure out how to get myself out of this, or how do I make it better? And then we get into, the curiosity and the journey and all of that other stuff. But most of that starts with again, like trying to avoid having to do something different. We just really want our way to work better.
I really love that sort of like factory setting, 1.0 software. And it's interesting. I see people in my family who've taken that 1.0 software, and some have run with it and kind of kept it part of the system, and others have wholly rejected it. I look at my mom. She grew up in a family that was very thrifty and has taken kind of like resented that thrift, right? It was a family with money, but was very thrifty, and she resented that thrift. And so if you ask my mom, if my mom asks you for a Christmas or a birthday present and you tell her something you'd like, you're going to get the most deluxe version of that thing, because she sort of rejected that 1.0 software and said, no, we're not gonna do it that way. But I look at my own life, and in many ways I run it much the same as my parents did. So you've got these 4 sort of pillars of the money script. Can you talk a little bit more about those, the events, the messages, the feelings, and the meanings? And then once someone becomes aware of their money script, like, okay, so now you're sort of aware of this 1.0 software, where do we go next?
Well, so we're going to either repeat, reject, or I hope that we can also add refine.
Yeah.
You just mentioned your mom kind of went on the rejecting, right? Like, I don't like my 1.0, I'm going to do the opposite.
Yeah.
So that's where a lot of us land, is like, if repeat doesn't work, we're going to just say, all right, clearly the other thing, if we're only looking at it in binary terms, I'm going to go to the other side of that. The refining is the part that is usually, it takes more work. It's hard. It's not intuitive. It takes paying attention. And if people have a lot of powerful emotions around money, it's really hard to pay attention. Attention gets complicated. And also, I would add, we live in a society that is pretty complicit in having people avoid all of this stuff. Like, the reason that I went into this business, and I don't know if it's true for you too, but I really went in with like the zeal of an evangelist of like, people, we got to start talking about this stuff, and wanting to provide in my professional role, but also my mission of being the place where people can explore that. So it's not just like, oh, I'm answering some question prompts about what are the messages, what are the experiences. We have to be able to, in many cases, take the messages, the experiences, meaning, emotional climate, like those things are coming in as like this tightly bound knot. And the process of financial therapy or self-exploration is really like, oh, there's a knot. What are the parts of this knot? Let me sort of explore this string. Let me explore this over here. To be able to give this the attention, and not just the attention and like rational attention, but to allow ourselves to kind of recapture those feelings that are tied up in this knot as well, to be able to start to get some clarity. And that's kind of a new concept, I would say, in our world right now. And that's the work that I think is so important, is giving people a chance to get to know their knot, to kind of find those places where they might be able to loosen up some of those things and have better insight, but also a way, hopefully, because it's not like the process is becoming, I am not a fully rational human being who only makes like robotic and productive decisions about her money. I'm still, the same messy person that I was going into this, but I also have a lot more self-compassion about that. I can build some guardrails in, like, on those places where I know that I can kind of get off track. But I have the opportunity to have, like, in doing this exploration and doing this work, people can differentiate and partialize between the things that are just like, oh, it's quirky that whenever my life gets really crazy, my brain wants me to buy a new pair of jeans. My brain thinks if I had new jeans that I felt great in, I wouldn't have all of these other messy feelings. I can tell that to you, Daniel, and it sounds really funny, and I can kind of have a laugh over it. But I also the reality is that when I'm feeling yucky, I'm also thinking about cool designer blue jeans. And for everyone, I'd say, who's engaging in this, to be able to think about and to feel into all of those different complexities so that we can be discerning and not just trying to say, like, I wish I was a different financial person. Like, I wish I was less freedom-loving and spontaneous and impulsive. I wish I was disciplined and da-da-da-da-da. Like, they're wishing themselves into being a different person. Whereas there's a middle road in this refining where we can look at these pieces and be able to make a little bit more, I hate to use the word nuanced again, but more individualistic in terms of, like, this is me and this is important to me. And I'm just going to let myself, again, be this kind of person who doesn't do everything perfectly. And I'm going to put my kind of energy into being able to focus on behavioral change in a targeted way that's going to allow me to still be me, but maybe get me different results from my behavior.
Yeah, I'm taking a couple of great nuggets from our conversation. One is this repeat, reject, refine framework, which I just think is so good. I think so many of us, and I mean, I'm even pointing the finger back at myself in the way I've talked about these things, even on this podcast, we tend to fall into binaries of sort of good, bad, like, how can we get better? How can we stop doing this? How can we start doing this? And like time and again, I hear you advocating for sort of a middle path, right? I hear you advocating for curiosity, awareness, and refinement around the edges rather than binaries and good and bad and big change. Because I think a lot of us repeat, these behaviors sort of reflexively because they're unexamined and it's what we know and it's our 1.0 software. And then I think a lot of us reject them just as reflexively. Like, well, that sucked. Like, I don't want to do that without sort of understanding what drove that behavior in the first place. So I love this idea of the awareness of the knot that allows us to refine. I also had a podcast guest earlier today who was talking about his struggle with depression. There's a middle-aged man, and we were sort of commiserating about the ways that middle-aged men are not, encouraged to talk openly about their mental health, and how for him, and indeed for me, sort of somatic symptoms can be sort of an early warning sign, right? Like, oh, I can't sleep, or like my stomach's upset, or my back hurts, and it's sort of an early warning sign that something might be emotionally wrong with you. But as you were talking about the genes, it's the very same thing. I mean, for me, it's guitars and baseball cards, but it's the very same thing, right? That a lot of times a financial behavior can be a window into self if we allow it to be. And I really love that. I'm taking that from this as well.
Well, I did want to just sort of add on to that's my favorite thing about money. Honestly, like I'm not focused on the outcome of what happens then when people feel healthier. I'm in that kind of like battle zone with people because I feel so passionately about money's very unique way of being simultaneously a symbol and a tool. So we project all this meaning onto it, but we can also kind of manipulate it. And so just psychologically, like as a clinician, it's like the most wonderful kind of like, think of like play therapy, right? Like we have this great symbol. So it's fascinating to me to get into the money with people as a way of revealing, like I said earlier, it surfaces so much of who we are that my whole sort of philosophy is like, pay attention to your money because that's the mirror that you can look up into on a regular basis to have a reflective practice just for yourself, just like meditation or these other things. Like being able to be with money, with our feelings, I think is such a unique opportunity. Like for these men or the person that you were speaking with earlier to kind of notice like, look, I'm having all of these physical symptoms that are coming up for me around this. What in the heck is going on?
Yeah. I love it. There's so much. I'm gonna, flying to LA tomorrow, and I have lots of nerdy conversations to have with my wife now about our money scripts and which ones we want to repeat, reject, or refine. So the last sort of formal question I have for you before we tell people where they can find out more about your work. A couple years back, I forget which year, but a couple years back, GQ and other major outlets ran this story that was like a really deep dive on Johnny Depp's finances. And Johnny Depp had spent like $650 million and was on the verge of bankruptcy and may have gone bankrupt. I didn't follow it that closely after I read the article, but the article was this sort of really like salacious telling of, how many tens of thousands he spent every month on wine and this and that. You work with actors and creative people and have throughout your career. I wonder if you've seen sort of by occupation or by geography, if you've seen any patterns in the way that people think about and behave with their money.
I love this question. I love it. And working with creative professionals, which was kind of like certainly the intensive start to my career, because I was in agency practice with a social service agency that served the entertainment and performing arts community. And the life of people in the arts was typified by having really strong feelings of like professional identity, creative identity, love of the work, like all of these non-financial motivations that went into their relationship with the way that they earn money. And then on the other side of that is how like the very practical ways of how money comes in and goes out. And what I discovered is that it was very hard because of all of this kind of complex meaning about the ways to make money and the ways to make money in one's creative field versus like maybe having a survival job. We have different feelings about the different ways that money comes in. And because of these different feelings, we often have varying kind of behavioral responses to this. So, for example, like one of my clients who earned, she did more like commercial acting. Every so often she would get a commercial. That commercial might pay her $75,000, but she also might not work for a year, or she could get another job the next month. So how to budget that money, not knowing sort of what the future of your money is going to be, is very difficult. And what she said in a workshop was, I don't know if I'm rich or poor. I think I'm both.
Mm.
And I was like, that is 100% true, because you don't know if that $75,000 is all of your money or a tiny bit of your money. And so what I often saw with people, and what I would say is like the way that the kind of circumstances that were very typical in that industry, I think that those circumstances have really broadened into our larger economic picture. We have a lot more freelance kind of work, gig economies. We have people with multiple sources of income, portfolio careers, et cetera. And all of these things kind of, when we're thinking about how we organize ourselves for the present and the future, and we don't have a lot of information, that can be a pretty daunting task. And so the idea that we need to kind of come up with our own system, because if we look out into the kind of general kind of like financial media or typical advice that we get, we're often told, you start with your income and you make this kind of a plan. But if that's not the structure of your financial life, you just feel like, okay, there's no answer for me. And what people come up with on their own can be pretty crazy, not crazy, that's pejorative, but, can be in some ways extreme, but we don't know that that's extreme relative to our circumstances. I'm sure that there were many periods of Johnny Depp's life where he couldn't possibly spend the money that he had coming in because it was coming in so quickly. Yeah. But then if that changes, or if you have an expensive divorce, if something disrupts that pattern, we often are then very lost to be able to revise our way of being with money and to revise the way that we need to organize our behavior relative to that money in order to get ourselves out of trouble. And that's where I see it's like the whole world has become more like what it was for people in the entertainment business 20 years ago.
Yeah, it's a great point, because when you were talking about the actress doing the commercial, I was sitting here thinking that was me for 10 years of being on my own. And people would ask me, like, what do you get paid to give a speech? And you tell them, and they're like, whoa. And you're like, well, yeah, if you multiply that times 40 hours a week, that's a lot of money, but it's not like that, right? And you don't know when your next gig will be. And some months you'll speak 8 times, and some months you won't speak at all. And there will be a blizzard and you can't make it to a show. And then there's COVID, and there's all these things. And like, we're all actors now in a sense, and we're all sort of having to navigate these, like you said, portfolio careers and having to shift between moments of abundance and scarcity. And it's nothing we're really wired to do. And it's nothing that I think the conventional financial literacy has set us up to be equipped for. it's all sort of based on a W-2 every 2 weeks sort of model. And we need people like you speaking to these more complex systems.
I embrace the mess. I love the mess. I find the complexity one of the most interesting things about being a human in the world. You know, I feel like money is where our inside world and outside world meet.
Mm-hmm.
And in being able to be in alignment with our money, or even to know what alignment with our money would be, to have a picture of like, not just all the things that we should be doing so that like our account columns measure up, but so that we're living the life that we feel called to lead, and how to make friends with money in that journey, as opposed to seeing it as either the kind of like fantasy savior of, oh, if I just have enough money or more than enough money, everything in my life will be great. Or I don't have enough money, everything in my life is bad. You know, how do we manage the complexity that it can be both at once in many ways, or because we don't know the future, we don't know which one it's going to be, and to still be able to have I think of like healthy behaviors with money that allow us to just kind of hold that frame and hold that inquiry where we are clear on what our money is doing. We're clear on what our sort of feelings and desires are that we want in our life. And we have a container, like a behavioral container, a time and space container, to be able to do the work of awareness and integration, to be able to make decisions where it's like, I realize I'm just kind of like, I'm putting my chips on the table. I'm saying this is the bet in terms of like how I think this is going to go. And then we sit back and are able to see how well that bet plays out, and to be able to continue to make those refinements or those adjustments on an ongoing basis.
Yeah, well, comfort with the messy middle is what it's all about. You know, the more I learn about money, it's not a savior, it's not a panacea, but it's also not nothing, right? And sort of, I think we tend to gravitate toward extremes, but learning to exist in that middle is where we need to be. And your work is hugely important in moving us toward that middle. If people want to read more of that work, if they want to learn more about what you're up to, get in touch about this upcoming podcast, where can folks find you?
It's very easy. All you have to do is know my name, Amanda Clayman. I'm at amandaclayman.com, and that's where you can find, I have some wonderful LinkedIn learning courses there. And like I said, the podcast information, etc. Also, I've done some writing. You were referring to some of the writing. I don't write very much anymore, but I have a ton of content banked on that website.
Yeah, beautiful. Amanda, thank you for helping us navigate that messy middle.
My pleasure, Daniel. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for tuning in to Standard Deviations. If you can't wait till next week for more behavioral finance insights, visit www.orion.com. All opinions expressed by Dr. Daniel Crosby and podcast guests are solely their own opinions and do not reflect the opinion of or endorsement by Orion and its affiliates, subsidiaries, and employees. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as a basis for legal, tax, and investment decisions. The opinions are based upon information the participants consider reliable.